my administration looked at the facts and the history and looked at the intelligence in Iraq, and we saw a threat. He's clearly saying that September 11th is the reason he looked at Iraq differently and saw a threat there.
Yeah, are you surprised by that?
Yes.
Because
Iraq 11th, had nothing to do with September 11th.
After September 11th, of course you look at threats differently. Your country's just been attacked. You know that you cannot allow threats to materialize. Do you know how many times I've been asked...
But there was nothing in the threat that Iraq presented that was in any way related to us in September 11th.
We can end this interview right now if you don't want me to finish my point. Thank you. If one looks at what happened to us on September 11th, we didn't connect the dots. There was a threat materializing that we didn't respond to. Saddam Hussein had been a threat from the time that he invaded Iran in the late 1980s through the 1991, when in fact he went into Kuwait, dragging us into war. We thought he had reconstituted his weapons of mass destruction. And in a context in which terrorism and weapons of mass destruction was a nexus that we could not allow, we decided that this was a threat that had to be dealt with.
40,000 casualties later in Iraq, 4,400 American military deaths in Iraq later. Would you say that is the single biggest miscalculation that the Bush administration made, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and must be stopped by those military men who went in there and found no weapons of mass destruction?
Saddam Hussein was a threat. He had used weapons of mass destruction.
But we now know he wasn't a threat.
This was not... Lawrence, are we going to do this with my answers or with your commentary? We had not focused on the fact, you have not focused on the fact, that Saddam Hussein had been a threat to the United States of America, to the Middle East, since he invaded Iran. Now, we made the wrong call then, and we supported him against Iran. He then became a more monstrous threat. After 1991, shooting at our aircraft in the no-fly zone that was supposed to be keeping his Air Force on the ground, trying to reconstitute his weapons of mass destruction, breaking out of the sanctions through the scandalous oil for food program. Yes, he was a threat. With or without mature weapons of mass destruction, he was a threat. And nothing of value is ever won without sacrifice. Of course, the lives lost will never be brought back. But in Iraq, that is not a threat to invade its neighbors, not a threat to reconstitute its weapons of mass destruction, not a threat to play Palestinian terrorists as suicide bombers. That's going to be a better Iraq and a better Middle East. And so, in fact, I think that what we did in Iraq will be demonstrated by history to be an important part, an important pillar of a new Middle East.
Well, I think history demonstrates that Iraq presented absolutely no threat to the United States whatsoever. And
well, that would be a surprise to the 16 Security Council resolutions that called him a threat to international peace and security.
Information that would be a surprise. Not true.
That would be a surprise. No. That was on the basis of his invasion of Kuwait and the weapons of mass destruction that were found there in 1991. The weapons inspectors who could not do their jobs and so left in 1998. The attack by President Clinton in 1998 to try to bomb those sites. It would be a surprise to the Kurds who he gassed, and the Iranians who he gassed, and the people in the south of his country who he gassed. It would be a surprise to the CIA that considered him a massive threat to international peace and security.
I think he was a threat to Kuwait. I think he was a threat to the Kurds.
You know,
I do not think he was a threat to New Yorkers.
Lawrence,
do you think he was a threat to New Yorkers?
You obviously have a very different view than the UN Security Council.
You obviously have a very different view. To New Yorkers
you obviously have a very different. You obviously have a very different view than those people who were flying the no-fly zones, like the soldier who's in my class at Stanford, who was shot at by Saddam Hussein. So you may not view him as a threat. Most of the world did.
Most of the world didn't, which is why we couldn't assemble the coalition that we would have liked to assemble
Lawrence,
to go in there.
How many countries? No. I have a question for you. No, I have a question question for you.
up to
I have a
this
question for you.
war.
How many countries fought in the coalition?
We don't have enough time to review all that history.
You've just made a charge.
I would like to review
Lawrence, you've just made a charge.
your feelings about things you said ramping up to the war.
No, not until...
The threat of a mushroom
we're
cloud
not going there.
from Saddam Hussein, you now know was completely false.
You know
Do you
what?
regret saying that?
Do you know what?
Would you take that back if you could?
You know what? You've just made a false statement. You said we couldn't assemble a coalition. How many countries fought in the coalition
actually
in
fought
Iraq?
And had casualties?
How many
actually
countries
fought?
actually? Yeah, how many?
Maybe a half a dozen actually fought.
Oh, I see. So the Georgians who went there and the Japanese
Actually
who went
had
there and
soldiers
others,
firing weapons on the ground?
this was not part of the coalition. The people who, the British and the Australians and the Poles and all of those who, the Canadians, all of those who ultimately were in Iraq, these were not part of the coalition.
Yes, they were.
Yeah. So your statement was just false.
About the mushroom cloud that you were completely wrong about, would you say that was possibly the single worst misstatement by a national security advisor publicly?
I said that we could not afford to have it be a mushroom cloud.
Where did you think that mushroom cloud would
Lawrence,
be?
you have a bad habit with your guests. You never let them answer a question.
Go ahead. Where would the
Thank
mushroom
you.
cloud be?
The question was, had Saddam Hussein actually reconstituted his nuclear weapons, or was he trying to? And if you look at the intelligence reporting at the time, it said that he could possibly reconstitute that nuclear capability within a year with foreign assistance, and that he was trying to do it.
But we
what
know
I said,
all that was wrong.
What I said,
he couldn't have reconstituted
Lawrence,
anything in a year. We know. Why recite things that we know were wrong and have been proven wrong?
Because what you know today can affect what you do tomorrow, but what you know today cannot affect what you did yesterday. So at the time, we didn't know that he had not reconstituted. The intelligence said he was reconstituting, that he was reconstituting his nuclear program. He had reconstituted his biological and chemical program. He was shooting at our aircraft. He was a threat to international peace and security. He'd been sanctioned by the UN 17 times on that course. He was a threat.
The aluminum tubes that you said were used exclusively for nuclear weapons obviously were not. They were the kind of tubes that were used for rockets. When you say that intelligence indicated that, your White House was using intelligence incorrectly. You were misstating what the intelligence actually was.
Lawrence, we can do this one way or another, all right? You can let me answer your questions, or you can make rhetorical statements.
Let's talk about the aluminum tubes that you were so wrong about. That's one of those things you like to use as an indication of what the intelligence was telling you, but the White House was misinterpreting the intelligence.
No. This was not the White House misinterpreting anything. The director of the CIA briefed the Congress that those aluminum tubes were most likely for nuclear capability.
You said exclusively.
We believed that the tubes, given Saddam Hussein's history, given the long trail of what he was trying to acquire, were for nuclear weapons. Now, you were right. The intelligence turned out to have been wrong. But you know, you don't get up in the morning and say, you know, my intelligence might be wrong. You have to act on the intelligence that you have. And that's the intelligence that we had at the time.
When you look at what we now are calling the Arab Spring, and you look at these uprisings against these dictators in the region, would it have been better now, knowing what we all know now, would it have been better to wait and let history catch up with Saddam Hussein in Iraq? Do you think we might have a similar uprising in Iraq today?
Saddam Hussein was a threat, and we dealt with the threat. We didn't go to Iraq to bring democracy any more that dealing with Adolf Hitler was to bring democracy to Germany. But once there, we felt that we had to help the Iraqi people get to democracy. And it's simply ill-informed and ahistorical to suggest that a dictator as brutal as Saddam Hussein would have allowed an Arab uprising in his country. You're looking at a dictator in Syria put down an uprising. You're looking at a dictator in Libya who has tried to put down an uprising. And if you want to talk about a humanitarian disaster, why did we go into Libya? Because he was about to mow down his own people. He was going to eliminate his own people. He was going to commit genocide against his own people. Saddam Hussein committed chemical warfare against his own people. And I'd really like to have an answer from those who say, it was a good thing to intervene humanitarian way in Libya because Gaddafi was killing massive numbers of civilians. Saddam Hussein put 400,000 people in mass graves. He used chemical weapons against Kurds and Shia. If that wasn't a humanitarian reason to intervene, quite apart from the security reasons, I really think people have a lot of explaining to do.
But you would grant the style of intervention in Libya and Iraq is totally different.
Well, yes, because Libya and Muammar Gaddafi are thankfully not Saddam Hussein. But if you think for 1 minute that you were going to be able to take Saddam Hussein down by mass protests in the streets, then you're clearly ill-informed.
We'll never know. Dr. Rice, thank you.
Yeah, you're right. We'll never know. But I would have to say anybody who thinks that that's going to happen would have to be pretty ill-informed.
That'll be the last word. Dr. Rice, thank you very, very much for joining me.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
What jumped out for you? I think there might be an item or two you want to take issue with.
Well, I mean, I'm very glad that you asked her about the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud thing that she said, and the aluminum tubes are only usable for nuclear purposes, not for what Saddam actually had them for. Just to see her evade those questions entirely. And the times when she got most angry with you were not when you were being particularly argumentative or interrupting her in any particular way, but when you were asking her about things that she plainly had absolutely no answer for. And it is, I mean, she all but said, "You forgot Poland." I mean, to hear the former Bush administration, to hear a former Bush administration official of that rank ping between the same old assertions about Saddam as if it's 2002 again, comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler, talking about the oil for food program being a justification for that war, to hear her pinging between that and essentially trying to pretend like the second Gulf War was the first Gulf War, that the threats of Saddam Hussein posed when he invaded Kuwait for the first Gulf War was the reason that we had to go back in 2003. I found it to just be a jaw-dropping and astonishing, evasive interview.
She will not respond to any question that you form that includes any information we know now that we didn't know then. That's the way she handles weapons of mass destruction. She just refuses to deal with the question as we now know all the facts to be, and goes back to, well, this is what we were thinking, and yeah, it turns out the intelligence was false, and so you just keep running up against this frustrating thing. You know, listen, I stopped short. There is this quote in Bob Woodward's book, State of Denial, where David Kay, the chief weapons inspector that we sent over there to try to find the weapons of mass destruction after the war, he said about Condoleezza Rice, she was probably the worst national security advisor in modern times since the office was created. Now, I was a gentleman. I left that out. But it's a relentlessly frustrating experience, Rachel, to talk to her and not be able to get her to engage on what we know now.
But that in itself, I think, was very, very illuminating. I feel like after watching that interview, there is one thing that I understand better than I've ever understood before, which is that the Bush administration folks like Condoleezza Rice really think there are no lessons to be learned from then sending us to war on the basis of a threat that did not exist. She told you, you don't get up in the morning and say the intelligence could be wrong. She's asserting that now, as if there's no reason to ever take a critical eye toward intelligence that's being provided to you when she served in an administration that stovepipe politically convenient intelligence around the mainstream intelligence apparatus in order to get exactly what they wanted in terms of answers. She still believes that you can blame anything on intelligence, and it makes me just very, very thankful that there has been a change in the political order in this country, because those folks still believe they did Iraq right.
That is precisely why David Kay said she was the worst national security advisor, this inability to question intelligence intelligently. I found outrageous, by the way, her comparison of what we're doing in Libya to what we did in Iraq, mount a full-scale invasion of Iraq, take over the country and try to build a whole new country. That's not exactly what we're doing in Libya.
And the case that she was making about Iraq could have been made against any country in the world. When she's talking about things that Saddam Hussein did years before that invasion as to people in his own country and to neighboring countries, justifying something that she insisted we do in 2003, I mean, then why didn't we invade North Korea? Why didn't we invade Sudan? Why didn't we invade anywhere else in the world? We did it to settle a score because after Osama bin Laden attacked this country, her administration, her included, decided to remake the world in an image that they felt was more politically convenient. They still haven't learned the lesson that that was wrong, and you laid that more bald today in that interview than anything else I've ever seen.